Ollama hits 112 tokens per second on an M4 Max. That's 50% faster than OpenRouter's cloud path. 0 per token cost, and if you're running thousands of calls a day, that gap compounds fast. Local AI is moving fast right now, and the hardware vs. cloud decision is real money, so I'm comparing Ollama versus OpenRouter across 5 head-to-head tests to find out who actually wins. But the speed gap doesn't tell the whole story. There's a context window difference that could completely change which one fits your workflow. My name is Brian, and I'm in these tools 12 hours a day, so you don't have to be. And every number here is traced to official pricing pages, docs, and community benchmarks. Both companies will actually stand behind. This one's for any developer running more than a few hundred AI calls a day, where cost, speed, and privacy all matter. Test 1. Cost. So here's a concrete scenario. You're running an AI agent that fires off 10,000 API calls a month, and with OpenRouter's 5.5% platform fee stacked on top of per token charges, that bill grows in a way that's really easy to miss until you're staring at an invoice you didn't plan for. Ollama's local software costs you nothing per call, so the question is whether the hardware upfront kills that advantage. I looked at both pricing pages side by side, and Ollama's local software is free, 0 per token cost. You just pay for electricity and hardware that can run $2,000 on the low end or up to $40,000 for a serious GPU rig. OpenRouter charges per token plus that 5.5% fee on every credit purchase. And what surprised me is the enterprise flip. At scale, OpenRouter's $200,000 a month tier actually drops the fee entirely, which Ollama can't match without serious GPU investment. Ollama takes cost. The hardware expense makes this closer than it looks on paper, but if you already own a decent Mac or GPU rig, the per token math just isn't comparable. Ollama is free to run and OpenRouter charges you every single call, so the safer pick for cost control on owned hardware is Ollama because the downside of getting this wrong is a recurring bill you can't turn off. That's 1 for Ollama, 0 for OpenRouter. Test 2. Coding benchmark performance. The objection I keep hearing is that local models are fine for simple stuff, but the moment you need real agentic multi-file work, they fall apart. And that's a fair concern because consumer GPUs cap out around 32 billion parameters, and some of the best coding models right now are way bigger than that. Let's see what the actual benchmark data says about how far apart these two really are. What I found is pretty interesting. Ollama's Qwen 2.5 Coder 32B tops consumer hardware coding benchmarks on a 24GB GPU with community-reported scores that hold up well for everyday tasks. But OpenRouter hosts MIMO v2.5 and GLM 5.2, models that are just too large to run locally on most setups. The agentic multi-file edge goes to OpenRouter's MIMO v2.5, though bear in mind that's a vendor claim performance figure, not an independent test. Now, the gap here is real, but not as wide as it sounds for most people, because community data says local models handle 70 to 80% of everyday coding tasks, as well as GPT-4o. So if you're doing standard feature work, Ollama's top models are in the conversation. The frontier advantage only kicks in when you need those massive context windows, or the absolute cutting-edge agentic benchmarks. OpenRouter takes coding performance. Qwen 2.5 Coder closes the gap more than I expected at the everyday level, but when the models you need physically can't run on your GPU, that's a hard ceiling, and the safer pick if you need frontier-scale agentic coding is OpenRouter, because the downside of betting on local here is missing models you simply can't download. That ties it up. Ollama 1, OpenRouter 1. Test 3. Speed. The number that got my attention right away is 112 tokens per second. That's what Ollama's MLX backend puts out on an M4 Max. And for context, if you're running a coding agent that generates a few thousand tokens per response, the difference between 74 and 112 tokens per second is the difference between feeling snappy and watching a progress bar. Network latency on top of that cloud path makes it worse. I looked at the decode numbers carefully. Ollama on MLX hits 112 tokens per second and a prefill speed of 1,110 tokens per second on M4 Max, while OpenRouter's VLLM path averages around 74.5 tokens per second under load. and I couldn't find a published prefill figure for OpenRouter at all. On top of that, OpenRouter adds edge caching and routing logic that warms up over the first minute or two in a new region, whereas Ollama's local path has zero network overhead. Ollama wins speed, and it's not subtle. Cloud infrastructure with smart caching closes the gap less than you'd think, because local hardware with zero network hops just wins on raw throughput every time. So the safer pick, if speed consistency matters, is Ollama, because the downside of the cloud path is latency you can't control. That puts Ollama ahead 2-1. Alright, so Ollama is ahead on cost and speed, but context limits and deployment flexibility are still coming up. And those two tests could completely change the decision for a lot of you. Because if your workflow needs long documents, big code bases, or multimodal inputs, the calculus shifts. Stick around because the context test in particular has a number that I think will surprise most people. Test 4, context and output limits. The day your local model runs out of context mid-task is a bad day. Ollama defaults to just 4,000 tokens on a GPU with less than 24 gigabytes of VRAM, which isn't enough for a lot of real coding tasks. And while you can bump it up with an environment variable, you're still capped by how much VRAM you have. For long document work or big repo refactors, that ceiling matters a lot. What I found here is a pretty big gap. OpenRouter's top models, Mimo V2.5 and DeepSeek V4 Flash, both hit 1.05 million tokens of context, while Ollama maxes out at 256,000 tokens only if you've got 48 gigabytes or more of VRAM, and most people are running less than that, so they're stuck at 32,000 or lower. Ollama does recommend 64,000 tokens for coding and agent tasks, which at least tells you what you need. And configurability is a tie since both let you set context per request or via env-var. To be fair, most everyday coding tasks don't need anywhere near a million tokens. And if you're working on focused feature work or short scripts, Ollama's 32,000 to 64,000 token range is plenty for that. The gap only becomes painful when you're doing large repo analysis, long document summarization, or running agents that need to hold a lot of state at once. So think about your actual use case before you write this one off. OpenRouter takes context. VRAM-based limits turned out to be more than a minor footnote. A 4x gap between 256,000 and 1.05 million tokens is a real workflow constraint for anyone doing large-scale work, and the safer pick if context depth is your bottleneck is OpenRouter, because the downside of getting stuck at 4,000 tokens mid-task is a broken run you have to restart. That levels it up. Ollama. 2. OpenRouter 2. Test 5. Deployment and modality. Here's a concrete scenario, a solo developer who needs to prototype with sensitive client data on a Friday night, because sending that data to a third-party cloud API is a non-starter for a lot of teams. But on the flip side, if you need image understanding or access to 400 different models without downloading anything, a local install just can't give you that. And these two tools are solving genuinely different problems here. Ollama runs fully offline. Your data never leaves the machine. Full stop, and it supports over 40,000 community integrations, which is pretty wild. OpenRouter gives you one API key that unlocks 400 plus models across 70 plus providers, including image generation and image understanding that Ollama just doesn't do locally. And setup is faster on OpenRouter since Ollama requires installing software and pulling models down, which takes time and storage. Deployment is a genuine tie. These two tools are doing different jobs. Ollama wins on privacy and offline capability. OpenRouter wins on model variety and zero setup access. And neither is the safer pick universally, because it just depends on what you need. Call it even. Ollama wins on cost control, 0 per token costs. Once you own the hardware, unlimited calls for the price of electricity, and it wins on raw speed with 112 tokens per second on M4 max and 0 network latency. Privacy is another clear win since your data never touches a third-party server. And for consumer hardware coding, QN 2.5 Coder 32B on a 24GB GPU is genuinely competitive. OpenRouter wins on model variety, one API key, 400 plus models, 70 plus providers, no hardware required, and it wins on context with 1.05 million tokens on MIMO v2.5 and DeepSeek v4 Flash, which Ollama just can't touch on consumer hardware. For agentic coding at the frontier level, OpenRouter's model roster is in a different class, and at enterprise scale, the $200,000 a month tier drops all fees. I went in thinking Ollama's speed advantage would be the whole story, 112 tokens per second versus OpenRouter's cloud path. But the context window gap made this a lot closer than that. So here's the decision rule. If you own the hardware and need privacy, pick Ollama because you get 0 per token cost, and your data never leaves your machine. If you need frontier models or 1.05 million tokens of context without buying a GPU, OpenRouter is the pragmatic call. If you want to see how Ollama holds up against a full agentic coding tool, I did a full breakdown called Ollama versus Claude Code, Can Free Local Keep Up? It answers exactly the question this video leaves open, about whether local inference is actually enough for serious agent workflows, and it's worth watching right after this.